Hi, friends. Thanks for joining us. Let's see. We ready to go? Okay. I'm Aura Kanagas. I direct the Office of Public Policy and Advocacy for the American Friends Service Committee. Um, the Office of Public Policy and Advocacy leads AFSC's organization-wide efforts to achieve our public policy-related goals. We try to carry the voice of AFSC's program experience from throughout the U.S. and across the globe to policymakers in the nation's capital. And we work to engage AFSC's program staff and constituencies, like you, in organization-wide strategies to affect policy change through coordinated local, regional, and national actions. So we're here today to talk about what we've seen so far and expect ahead over over the first 100 days of the Biden administration and the 117th Congress. As you may know and may feel yourselves, there is tremendous pent-up demand for efforts to both address damaging policies enacted over the last 4 years, but also toward long overdue efforts to bring about greater equity and justice in U.S. domestic and global policies in so many arenas. And so many of those arenas AFSC works on and focuses on and engages with impacted groups who are navigating the realities of day in and day out. As you likely know, the election of 2 Democratic senators in Georgia has brought the Senate to a 50-50 split in which Vice President Harris can act as a tie-breaking vote. So with a slim but Democratic majority in the House and a slim but Democratic majority in the Senate, it might seem that all systems should be go if the Democrats are in agreement on an issue. But you may have heard terms like filibuster and reconciliation kicking about in reference to this narrow majority. Peniel has threatened to be very unquakerly to any of us who talk about reconciliation. But I will just say that the good news is you don't really need to know what reconciliation means. But the simple version is that with Senate rules requiring a 60-vote majority to advance to debate on a measure, little could advance in a climate of high partisanship. But a tool called reconciliation, which, like we said, most non-wonks do not need to know, except that it is limited to use 1 or 2 times a year and strictly on matters of taxation and budget. That reconciliation process allows a measure to advance with only a 51-vote majority for passage. So there is going to, in Congress, be a lot of focus on what can be piled into that reconciliation process, except in places where there really is a strong bipartisan majority willing to move on an issue. The administration, therefore, is doing a lot to advance the executive orders and other things that they do have influence to move ahead with. So I'm going to introduce my colleague, Tori Bateman, who's going to talk a little bit about what we see ahead from what we have seen so far and see ahead from this administration and this Congress. And Peniel is then going to Peniel Ibe is then going to hop in to help you think about what you can do to affect change in these areas and be part of helping to create the climate that we know is needed to give both the administration and Congress the mandate to move forward toward more progressive policies. So with that, I will hand it over to Tori.
Thanks, Ara, and hey, everybody. It's great to have everyone on, and thank you for your interest in all of the policy stuff that's been happening. It's been a really wild, 2 or so weeks since the inauguration, and we've had so much happening that it's really hard to get your head around it, even if you're reading the news all day long. So I'm going to do a very brief and non-comprehensive overview of some of the stuff that we've seen over the past weeks. There's been a lot of executive actions that have been happening, over 30 of them. So as I mentioned, this will be non-comprehensive, but there's a lot of exciting pieces that we wanted to share. And then after I do a quick rundown of some of those things, I want to share a little bit about what we're expecting to see in the next couple of months, both from the Biden administration and things that the Biden administration is working with Congress on. So these executive actions, first things first, there's been a ton of them on immigration. President Trump had intentionally left a horrific mess in the immigration system, and a lot of Biden's initial executive orders were aimed at fixing some of those things. To name a few, there was one that ensured that no new people are going to be enrolled in the migrant protection protocols. That's the program that forced asylum seekers to wait across the border in Mexico while their asylum cases played out. Another executive order protected the DACA program, which provides legal status to people who came to the US as children. The administration has also begun the process of reestablishing asylum protections and developing strategies for addressing the root causes of migration in collaboration with Northern Triangle countries, so El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. He also really notably stopped border wall construction and is trying to find ways to move money out of the border wall. He established a task force to find children who were separated from their families and reunite them with guardians. He also tried to institute a 100-day moratorium on deportations while the administration reviewed some of his policies, but that ended up getting stopped by the courts. It's very important. Well, that was not comprehensive, but it's like a little bit of what's happened. And I want to really take a time to note that these executive orders are not perfect. And there's a lot of areas in which we're going to have to keep the Biden administration accountable, especially in this immigration space. For one, it's really important to note that when the deportation moratorium was challenged in the courts, there are still massive deportations happening, largely targeting Black migrants. Even within the next 2 weeks, we're expecting to see almost 2,000 Haitian migrants deported, which is horrific. And the Biden administration really needs to be kept accountable for allowing this to continue. We're also really concerned that even though he stopped border construction, Biden's just going to pivot to a smart or virtual wall, which will add to the militarization of the region and the surveillance of communities using technology instead of a physical wall. We also are watching all of these promises to terminate the migrant protection protocols and fix the asylum system that still need to go through a lot of review processes and implementation, and knowing that we have to keep the Biden administration accountable for living up to the things that they've committed to in these executive orders. So it hasn't just been immigration executive orders that have gone through. I do want to highlight one especially that says the Department of Justice will not renew contracts with private prisons. People currently in private prisons won't be immediately relocated while existing contracts exist, but this is the start of dismantling the really horrific industry of private prisons. But again, like the immigration EOs, this can definitely go further. We want to note that this does not include immigration detention centers, which can still be private. So Biden could implement a similar ban there. And of course, it's also really important that the Biden administration prioritizes getting people out of prisons entirely. And the third bit I want to mention, in addition to immigration and these private prison pieces, is some of the moves that the Biden administration has taken to rejoin the international community. Pretty early on, he rejoined the Paris Climate Agreement and the World Health Organization. Today, he made an announcement that the U.S. is pulling out of offensive operations in Yemen, where our U.S. support has contributed to massive humanitarian disaster. So these are good steps forward, but yet another area where we really have to keep the Biden administration accountable. He has been less than bold in his statements about U.S. militarism and ending endless wars. So we're going to really need to keep the administration pushing to end the harm of the U.S. abroad and to be investing in our communities instead of weapons and war. So that's just some of the stuff that's happened in the first 2 weeks. It's a lot, and there's no way it could be comprehensive now, but there's lots of moving pieces. And there's some stuff that we're looking forward to as well. Biden has been working with Congress, first of all, on this COVID relief bill, which is likely to include stimulus payments, among other things. These bills are incredibly important to Congress and the president because they want to support public health and the economy during the pandemic, and they're prioritizing getting these through. And there's some really bold proposals that we're excited about for what could end up in these packages, including things like a $15 federal minimum wage, protections for workers, release for people that are incarcerated, direct cash stimulus payments for people regardless of immigration status, and things like that. So we're excited to see where that goes and are ready to push for progressive changes in the COVID bill. There's also a really big immigration bill that Biden's team has put together in collaboration with Congress called the U.S. Citizenship Act. And the bill does a lot of things, but the biggest thing that I want to flag is that it would create a roadmap to citizenship for all 11 million undocumented people in the U.S. And that's something that we'd really like to see get done. The third thing that we're watching is the president's budget. The president is responsible for putting out a budget every year, and this one will outline spending for fiscal year 2022. And we're watching this really closely because it's an opportunity for the president to push for major shifts from militarized spending, so things like Pentagon, abusive immigration enforcement, into the things that keep us actually safe and address actual problems, including funding responses to climate change and the pandemic. So that's something that we're watching and really hoping that he's willing to make big changes in, and that'll be out this spring. And then finally, as I mentioned, there's going to be a ton of reviews and reports and strategies coming out of the administration after all of these executive orders over the next 3 months that'll give us a better understanding of exactly how bold these policies are going to be and exactly how much of the injustice over the past 4 years is going to be continued or not continued. So we need to watch that and keep him accountable to the promises that he's made and make sure that he goes as far as possible to dismantle some of these unjust systems that have been set up. Simply returning to Obama levels of injustice is not acceptable. We need to go way farther than that. And to do that, we're going to need a lot of grassroots activism and a lot of energy in communities. And I want to pass it to my colleague Panel for some of the ways that people can keep pressure up on the administration and Congress on some of these things.
Thanks, Tori, and thanks, Aura. So hi, everyone. Panel here, the Policy Engagement Coordinator. So Tori has really run down a whole bunch of things that have been happening from the administration's lens. We do know that Congress does have to work, albeit that there is some sort of lock and they're not sure who's leading who and who's in charge. All of that really doesn't matter to us because as advocates, we need to continue putting the pressure on both the administration and Congress. These are both chambers of elected officials that we voted in. And so regardless of how they're figuring out how to do their job, our goal is to make sure they know what we want them to do when they figure out how to do their job. And that involves a host of things. I think the biggest framing for us is that we want to see policy changes that are bold, compassionate, and humane. Whether it's economic justice, whether it's climate justice, whether it's immigrant justice, whether it's healing justice for incarcerated community members and formerly incarcerated community members. We have a slim window, it seems, in Congress very often to pass something that can make our communities' lives better, that can help our communities without hurting our communities. But we also know that the administration has power, like they've already been using with the executive orders, to pass policy changes. And so these are two targets that we want to make sure that our voices are being heard. We want to make sure that we're passing along conversations around what principles we want to see govern policy changes. For some of us that are not really into the wonk of the policy and what bill text says what and what line says what, you want to make sure that when you're reaching out to your members of Congress, you're doing so often to establish relationships and you're reaching out to remind them of the policies that drove you to vote them into power. And if these are policy officials, elected officials that you maybe didn't vote for, you still have a role in holding them accountable because they make decisions on behalf of the community that you live with. And so here at AFSC, we invite you to join us with the multiple tools that we continue to put out at our Action Center. If you sign up for our weekend reading, you get up-to-date blog posts that tell you what's happening and how you can take action. We give you tips. We also give you some talking points so that when you're in those spaces with your members of Congress, you know what to say and you know how best to advocate for yourself and your community. It's been about 2 weeks since Biden started, releasing multiple executive orders, but in the immigration space, it's still very tense. There's still a lot of concern. Like Tori said, we're anticipating over 2,000 people being deported, especially back to Haiti. These are Black immigrants in Black History Month. It goes against the very fabric of the racial equity executive order that the Biden administration put out. And so we need to push back against them. But we also need to think about the fact that we continue to see ICE, a rogue agency, ignore morality, humanity, their national obligations and international obligations by detaining and deporting individuals, especially in the middle of a pandemic. AFSC has joined the call to free them all from both systems of incarceration for citizens and domestic individuals, but as well as immigration detention centers. More than ever, we need to be making sure that we are looking towards a future without punishment, without incarceration as a framework. And so we invite you to visit our Free Them All landing page to learn about how we're communicating about this, how you can talk to your family members, your community members about why we need to decarcerate and let people away from detention prisons, from jails, etc. We're also calling on Congress to stop funding these infrastructures. Our Defund Hate campaign calls to defund ICE and CBP. It is time for Congress to stop writing a blank check for these agencies that waste taxpayer dollars, undermine our values, tear communities apart, separate families and loved ones, and still are unaccountable to the very government and the very administration that says they control them. We have seen multiple times, even till today, where ICE continues to do whatever they want to do. They continue to terrorize community members and they're not being able to be held accountable. And so we ask you to join us in calling for a defunding of the agencies, ICE and CBP, and join us even further to call to abolish these agencies. We believe that no one should be imprisoned in immigration detention or deported, not in the next 100 days, not ever. It is critical that we stop creating systems that criminalize immigrants and respect migration as a human right. And so AFSC, we've shared our petition in the chat. So we ask you to reach out to your member of Congress to say an agency like ICE cannot exist. And we also say we want bold, humane, compassionate values towards immigration. Those are juxtapositions, and we need to make sure that we're calling out those issues and pushing forward our principles. And when we are protecting people from detention and deportation, we have 11 million undocumented people and underdocumented people in the United States. This includes DACA recipients, or Dreamers as they're colloquially named, TPS holders, DED holders, farm workers, some people say essential workers, and their family members. 11 million undocumented people have lived in the United States, have contributed to their communities, are pillars of society and support in their communities, and need a pathway to citizenship now. So we want you to continue to reach out to your members of Congress to say, you have to work with the Biden administration to pass legislation that creates a roadmap to citizenship for all immigrants, for all 11 million. And you have to do this without hurting people. You have to do this by passing legislation that does not increase immigration enforcement, does not militarize border communities, does not expand enforcement priorities that seek to harm the same community that they pose to give a pathway to citizenship. These are things that we need to keep reminding, because often we see that in moments where they want to pass legislation that protects immigrants, they pass immigration, they pass enforcement. And we're seeing more agents, we're seeing ICE having much more money and much more reins and reach into our communities and into our homes to terrorize our loved ones. We are in a pandemic. And that is not lost on us, and it's not lost on the communities that we serve, the directly impacted folks, Black and brown immigrants, Black and brown communities in the United States. It continues to devastate our community, and Congress is often going to be passing legislation that passes some form of relief for our community members. We need to call on Congress to take bold action to protect the health and well-being of our communities. This means addressing major public health challenges and economic challenges affecting us, from a federal minimum wage increase to citizenship for essential workers and all undocumented people, to ensuring that all taxpayers are eligible for stimulus payments, regardless of how they pay their taxes, through SSNs or ITINs or otherwise. Making sure that they have access to aid, at the local and state level, and that people who are incarcerated and are detained are protected and are released, because COVID is a public health crisis, but so are detention centers and so are prisons. And they were public health crisis before COVID came along. But what we're seeing now is that COVID has aggravated the situation, and we need to make sure that our elected officials are aware of this. We also have resources on our website to address that. And lastly, two more pieces. Tori has spoken about that we might be seeing the president's budget coming soon, and we need to keep an eye on what this Biden administration decides to fund. A budget is a moral document. It is supposed to reflect our priorities, and our priorities is protecting our community members. It's honoring the dignity of life in every individual. And so we have to stop spending on war. We cannot continue to fund acts of violence against our own community members, Black and brown communities that are over-policed and over-militarized, as well as other people around the country in the guise of foreign policy or national security. We spend more than $6 trillion and have been doing so, and we have killed multiple people through this budget, and multiple people have been displaced. That money could have a transformative impact on things that actually make our communities healthy, safe, and strong, like universal healthcare that would have been remarkable when we were facing a pandemic, like education and peace building, housing, and other priorities that we continue to raise at every junction that we need for a healthy, thriving community. We need to call Congress to order to say, you cannot continue to waste taxpayer dollars on weapons and war. It is time to reimagine what we mean by security. It is time to reimagine what we mean by investing in our communities and in the prosperity of our communities. And we often find that when we talk about immigration, the Biden administration and the US Citizenship Act has decided to sort of center the concept of addressing root causes of migration. And that means what spurs people to move. And in responding to that, we need to respect the right of people to stay. And that means not funding wars and corruption and et cetera that cause them to leave their communities. But that also means from the US border, either the northern border or the southern border, we need to start with a humane approach to immigration. That means not building walls that stand as monuments of xenophobia and racism, but rather listening to the communities at the border for what they need and how they've been impacted in the past, honoring and healing and restoring what was broken, and moving forward, collaborating with them to make sure that we are addressing their concerns, but that we're also thinking about the migrants in these policies. People fleeing violence or danger in their home countries should be welcomed with compassion, not met with overwhelming obstacles that threaten their lives and the lives of our border communities as well. So I hope you will join us at AFSC in the multiple ways that we're trying to solve, I like to say solve world poverty, essentially, but how we're making sure that our communities are centered, how we are uplifting their voices, because a lot of these demands do not come from DC. For AFSC, with every program that we work with across the country, we're listening to directly impacted individuals, we're listening to what they want, what they need, and when a policy is passed here, we're listening to how that policy was actually implemented versus how it was intended to be impacting people. And so we ask that you take this action, sign up for our Facebook Lives. We'll be hearing multiple updates from other programs as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peneal. And you see why it is such a pleasure to work every day with these wise, visionary, powerful colleagues. And as we have said, the most important part of bringing that vision to life is the public pressure on members of Congress. They may want to do all that we are asking, and the political climate needs to be ripe for it. So let's turn to a few of the questions in the chat. I know we have pressed our time, but there are a number of resources that have been shared. There's a reminder from one of our colleagues about the several other important calls, and a lot of calls around like, is it really possible for us to do comprehensive immigration reform? And I think some of that has to do with what we had said about that slim margin majority. For immigration reform, it is going to take a strong bipartisan majority to make change. The current political climate wouldn't be ripe for it today. We have to work to make it possible. The budget is a place where there are those trade-off arguments that talking about what are we buying with our tax dollars, and what are the trade-offs? What have we left unfunded as a result? And I think in some of these framings around fund and defund, people can think of it as a very radical thing. Defund ICE, how could we possibly do that? Well, what have we made choices not to fund because we are funding a deportation and detention machine? In prioritizing that, what have we given up? The point from Jennifer around COVID relief, I was just in some advocacy meetings on Palestine this morning with Congress, and was in a meeting with one of the Republicans that are one of the Senate folks seen as very reasonable. And boy, oh boy, did it not feel like I was talking to a very reasonable office. Wonderful guy who is willing to engage and debate, but we have work to do on so many of our issues. And so many issues, like the Palestine work, is not partisan in how it plays out. There are dominant views throughout both parties that we really need to work on in all of these areas. Panel and Tori, do you have things you want to hop in on?
I see a question from Arnie around the roadmap to citizenship, which is framed as, is the roadmap to citizenship a superhighway or a tortuous mountain road full of potholes? And I don't know that I'll risk trying to come up with a truly apt metaphor for what we have, but I can tell you what the Biden suggestion is, which is an 8-year-long pathway to citizenship that would include a 5-year wait to get a green card and then a 3-year wait for citizenship after that. And there are a whole bunch of hurdles in that process, including, language tests, civics tests. You have to pay your taxes. You have to pass background checks. There is a expedited pathway for people who already have DACA or TPS status or sub-farm workers, where they could be immediately eligible for the green cards. So I'd say it's somewhere in the middle of those two types of roads, where it could be worse, but it could also be a whole lot better. And we'd love to see that time frame of 8 years come down. We'd love to see some of those barriers, the tests and things like that be made easier. And I will flag that is one of the things that the Biden administration has also done through some of these executive orders, is call out the need to revisit the naturalization process to make it more accessible. And they say that they're going to be looking at things like fees and all of the other pieces. So hopefully that will produce a better process, and it's another thing to be watching.
And I will just add, I think, to the question around comprehensive immigration reform, we're trying to take back that language and put out compassionate immigration reform. That way, we're starting from a space that centers the human being in that policy. And the concern about that is, like, whether it's possible or not is not the issue. The issue is, what do they identify as reform? And reformative policies have never served the interests of our community members. When they say reform, they mean, okay, we'll have TPS and DACA have some citizenship, but we're going to build more detention centers, and we're going to block off asylum, and we're going to add some more agents on the ground in border communities. And that's what we do not want. And so we want, if there is legislation that's passing, it has to be clean. And clean means no militarization, no extra fund, no funding for any other anti-immigrant whim that could be brought, honestly, bipartisan. Some of these things are not just you think the Republican office is doing or otherwise. A number of our members truly do not understand what it means to have compassionate immigration changes. And how it reflects on us as a community, but what it looks like when an asylum seeker is navigating the process. And so we need to share those experiences. And that's the key piece of why we have to lift up the voices of directly impacted individuals. If I'm not having an asylum seeker or a former asylum seeker speaking to their member, I lose the nuance on how it really impacts that individual, because I have not walked in their shoes. So remembering to center the voices and look to your local community or AFSC for places where they're organizing with directly impacted individuals and making these demands.
Well, we thank you all for being with us, and we hope you will go to the links that you see in the sidebar to take action. And as Panel said, don't see policy engagement as something you do once or twice. You're building a relationship with your congressional offices that's rooted not in what's politically possible or expedient, but in what is the community experience, what is the lived experience on the other end of these policies. And we have tolerance for long arc change, but the need is now. So I want to thank all of you for being with us, and invite you to reach out to us anytime. We love to work with all of you and appreciate all of your work to bring about a more just and peaceful world.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Join us same time, same place on Thursdays. More cool AFSC folks will be here.